Hello everyone, today we talk about nobility and chivalry, the cultural and juridical definition of the hegemonic estate during the High Middle Ages, and more specifically reflecting briefly, well this is not going to be an excessively long video, on the difference between de facto and de iure nobility, the difference between the two, according to a famous definition by Mark Bloch that wrote importantly also about the differences between chivalry, let's say, and the definition properly of the nobiliar class accordingly in France, Germany, Italy, England, and that you can also find on the internet easy, especially if you read French. And it's a topic that we have already addressed here and there. I also created recently a medieval nobility playlist because this phase, let's say, before the lock of the 14th century or the end of the 13th, in some ways, actually from the end of the 12th, there were different stages in the definition of the military, the aristocratic military structure, I would say. Right, it's difficult not to approach this story from a structuralist point of view, but it was naturally a much more complex thing, and in fact I want to soon make videos about properly the meaning of chivalry and how, if you want, what we're witnessing here at the end of the High Middle Ages is exactly one of the most, one of the clearest moments of secularization and modernization of the world. Paradoxically, what we know stereotypically as chivalry is something that happened killing the same traditional one in the function, because in fact this is the point. Originally a knight was defined by his actions, right, whereas later was defined by a juridical status, the belonging to an estate, to a class, and was such by right just for having been born in a knightly family. And in fact this was the inheritance of actually the main vessel of knighthood at some point onwards. Of course there were chances to become knight also in different ways. Let's say that the class remained always open by a certain degree, but it's also undeniable that between the 12th to 13th century there is an important definition of the chivalric experience as a juridically closed class based on hereditarity, right? And this naturally happens, as always in history, when this same class feels threatened. We made videos about, let's say, mostly the 10th century. I think we talked about the definition of the military class, first of all, right? Properly the enucleation of one during the 10th, the 11th century. We also made videos on the gradual development of, say, that this period is a point of arrival from much older times, that if you want to see still from a kind of social point of view, of course you have to study mostly the Carolingian times, but that is older and that lives properly in the deepest veins of European tradition and is present properly in its military aristocratic meaning also in other cultures. The Arabs had something similar. This is to be found everywhere, like the Persians as well, just to remain closer to the Mediterranean and Europe. So the aristocratic military structure naturally occupies a central position in great part of the European Middle Ages. I think if you ask any kid today, we think the Middle Ages, like, they would tell probably the only thing, the knights, right? That's what they saw in video games, in these images that are still enormously loaded in archetypical meaning, right? And that we somehow neglect as such, right? Sometimes we say, well, this is just maybe at least our secularistic mind mostly says, well, yeah, that was this time that is the Middle Ages that we can define, or this strange thing like knights, like we don't see much of them before or later conceptually. Like they looked cool, but it was kind of this warrioristic stuff, and that's it. Chivalry and knighthood are completely different things from eventually what we see, even just from the shell, right? Literally, sometimes the armor, right? In fact, I think in popular culture, that's what the knight is, right? Plate armor, full plate armor that looks cool, right? And it's basically at the end, in the autumn of the Middle Ages, to quote Huizinga. And that, in fact, was just a pretty pale reminiscence of, but, also, I must say, yes, aesthetically pretty captivating one, but still of an order that was much older, and that we see in the merely material aspect of the steel plate there as a carcass, right, of something that was instead living and strong and powerful, and the center of the universe up to just a few centuries before, after all, right? And we haven't probably come to terms completely to the centrality, in fact, of this elite and what that meant, because also our modernity has gone completely in the opposite direction, even though it had the opportunity to maintain this elite in as a model, as a point of reference. It's not, as I often say, it's not modernity's fault, it's modern people's fault, right? There is a great deal of beautiful things in modernity that we haven't been able to exploit for the better. So do not criticize us for anything, for any idea per se, for every group, etc. Just what eventually people do in practice. See what was the principle, what was the archetype, and realize that it's humans that are universally failing their absolute potential and expectations, that whenever they rise to some superior form, they tend unavoidably towards, in an incredibly homogeneous way, towards all the during all the eras, right? And it's obvious that it's very difficult. I discovered this in even just as among medievalists, when we talk about, I don't know, even other people we know to study contemporary history, etc. But to explain a person today, even just a kid today, because that's the field, or even children, because those are the most precious assets that we have, because what we teach them is effectively what is going to change the world later, and this is in fact the crucial point we have forgotten, right? We raise children as animals kind of grazing out there without any kind of control, discipline, authority, order, and so we get surprised if adults are just lesser and lesser people individually. Well, that's all what psychology tells us, right? You have to form children, you have to form kids in order for them to be functional adults, right? But no, it's too much effort in individual commitment, also because if the parents especially are already idiots by themselves, believe me, that there is not going to be any chance for those children in the future to be different from their parents in practice. In any case, this is the point, right? In order to understand nobility and chivalry, we have to understand, and also knighthood, as properly the qualification, the practical qualification of this on the field. We have to make an enormous effort of understanding a world where, for example, it was not really a state, it was not really a defined center, where, and that is not much a matter of difference from today's structure from the one of the time. This is what you have been fooled, fundamentally, about. The world works exactly in the same way. Right? We don't live in states that somewhat work on their own magically, for which people just depend on them, right, and get maintained parasitically. No, states are made by people who work, who produce, who command, who order, who discipline, right? And there are those at the top that lead and those at the bottom that just follow. So it was in the past, except, again, we have hypothesized this order in an ever more materialistic ideology that makes us believe that, after all, now we are better because, again, we have technology, right? Not because we had the resources and the capacity to have people that discovered, no, especially how to apply that technology successfully. No, it's technology. It's the sheer matter of it. It's just something theoretical, even abstract, that you have no idea how to apply yourself, even though you're completely depending on it. Can you make an electric circuit on your own? No, but you basically depend on it, and you would prefer to kill yourself rather than live without at this point. So think how dependent you are. So we are essentially stealing other people's achievements as our own to comfort ourselves, not to face our individual inferiority. And these people instead lived in a time where the world was literally molded and shaped by their action. It was a ferocious action, but again, cannot be judged from our terms because, again, probably I've studied in some detail at this point in my life medieval warfare, and also properly as it should be done from the sources, and getting kind of a also systemic and statistic understanding of certain dynamics. And whatever you study, even we made videos about that recently, about the peace and truce of God, that dealt with that in the 10th, especially actually in the 11th century, and that in fact, the subtitle was "The Rational Order of Violence." Right, it was showing you how the reality of the time was not really anarchic, right? It was not really chaotic as you may imagine. It was such, if you take it from a broader perspective, if you increase the the scale, and you go look at the overall situation of Europe, politically fragmented, etc. But if you study it from the local point of view, which was the one where effectively, somebody had the means to wage, to properly rule, you realize that all those wars, all those raids, etc., were actually motivated, right, by an iron logic in the political, military, and social balance of the time. And it's not a surprise that the aristocratic military class in Europe, in Western Europe especially, was defined exactly in those centuries. Essentially what we call the milites, that, as you know, in Latin was a term that originally defined it comes from millet, literally. It's or I think it's the same etymology, that is because the Romans at the siege of Veii allegedly got paid for the first time there, because of the prolonged campaign, so it became a synonymous of soldier, right? So the miles in full Roman times, let's say, was the soldier par excellence, right? Was the legionnaire, right? And that also comes with an idea of it was mostly an infantryman, etc. In medieval times, miles is instead the standard term for what you would call the knight. Is not especially the idea of the cingulum militaris, in fact, is yet another Roman concept that properly showed there in the ancient, in fact, Indo-European ideal of the freeman in arm, right? He who had the cingulum militaris was provided with some part of the imperium, after all, so a faculty that was not for everybody, especially, in fact, in a Roman Empire that we decided to represent from the Enlightenment as some sort of republic or democracy, but was effectively a feudal state where even properly the equestrian class maintained always this kind of supernatural privilege that was very different from the one of the rest of the populace, right? Of the rest of the ideal of the citizen soldier, because it was even extra paid by the rest of society by some greater, properly religious power that derived from the, as you know, the European Association of the Freemen and the war horse, etc. So that what you see in medieval times is rather than equus, or that indicated just every mounted man. You understand how the language had gone secularized in a way. It's the term miles that takes over to define the trooper, because of the cingulum militaris mostly, and in a gradual fashion, because also properly cavalry, as you know, becomes decisive on the battlefield just for actually a very short time of the Middle Ages. Right, it was preponderant already from the early medieval one, but it's just between the 12th and the 13th century, that just even for 150 years actually, that on the Western battlefields cavalry was invincible. Right, infantry had no shot. Right, and this is also, interestingly enough, in fact, the same moment in which the real chivalric privilege is established in a deeper political and social sense. Because by the 10th and the 11th, instead, this class had formed just as those who bore arms, right, and had just distinguished themselves in a neatly fashion that was also transnational, because basically all over Western Europe, the miles was recognized as such. They were also technically the same people. There is factually no difference if you pick a Danish or a Sicilian or a Portuguese or a Polish knight. They are, aside from some shade, different shade, let's say, can be an ethnic influence here and there, but they're factually the same identical thing without any military relevant difference. And so it becomes really, and that's where this establishment is molded, right? Because these people initially are really properly those who have waged war to politically and socially order the community. For these people to rise, there were others to fall, and together with that, the original universal condition of nobility that was attached to freemen, right? This is very important and overlooked. Like in the Romano-Germanic world, as in the other traditional cultures, every freeman was considered a nobleman, right? And certain areas of Europe even maintained this idea, right? Especially the ones that had a greater public force, and so paradoxically, it's in fact in the feudal world that the difference is erased earlier, right? And this is also in fact what Mark Bloch traces the difference like. This is quite fascinating. We'll talk about it later perhaps, but here in fact the great difference occurs. Those who had been freemen before, that had normally been eligible for military service with the band, the general levy, were transforming themselves not just in people that just habitually were not professional soldiers, but at least were habituated to some kind of cattle raiding, kind of guerrilla type of involvement, right? Freemen every once in a while in early medieval times would have probably killed somebody, right? If it was a serf or another freeman or something, it was normal to just use your spear or bow or even sword if you were affluent enough. With second invasions, this dramatic situation where probably Western Europe also has to deal. We made a video recently about this, to deal all alone with the aggressions from the Normans, the Magyars, even the Slavs in part, especially on the Elbe. That was crucial for the political balance of Europe. Also the Renovatio Imperii even later, and the Saracens require a greater functionalization of the community that also incidentally reminds of the traditional Indo-European repartition between the warriors, the priests, and the workers, which it's been hotly debated in a sense because, of course, there was never like a full like categorical class division. There were cases. I think about Vedic India or surviving to this day, in at least in a recent cultural reality. That, however, were such because were eventually those were stratified, but normally, and especially in Europe, where social stratification was lower than in other countries, in other continents, on average, and kept to this day this idea that still individual is still kind of a free man. There was um, by default, at least by standard, and so also has a greater value and you know inspirational capacity, moral strength. The this high medieval moment brings to redefinition of the roles, right? So what we see as the ancien regime, that was actually defined by the 14th and 15th century rather than exactly by in the High Middle Ages, was, however, set in its premises exactly in these centuries between the 10th and the 13th. We can say that incidentally are also the ones of the actual revival of Europe in practice. They are the centuries of the great medieval civilization that we also don't know too much about, because really we began to write in a kind of also more modern and secular sense that aided to reconstruct it by the moment of the very crisis from the end of the 13th, mid 14th century. And that show, interestingly, that the larger the civilization, in a sense, the more important the functionalization of the roles becomes, right? And the greater the effort, the greater the forces. Europe booms in a way that we have observed mostly just from a material point of view, because of the structuralistic, materialistic influence on historiography. So demography and essentially economy, right? But those are just a consequence of a broad moral revival that seems to have been engineered also by a reinjection, in fact, of this military ethos that was all one with the religious one that was present both in the pagan and in the Christian background, and that in Europe probably found its greater synthesis, in fact, with the between all these various traditional forces coming from the Roman world, from the German world, from the even the Celtic world, the Slavic world, etc. Also partly the Greek one. I mean, this revival is present also in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, in the Near East. It's not just Europe. There are surely some let's say material reasons for which this happened. Many speak of a kind of a climate change that somewhat brought to the greater survival of people in general, so that there was more need to produce food to feed them. And in fact, if we really look at the crop rate, there was not any technological improvement really whatsoever. It was just an adaptation to this. This is also the ultimate delusion of progress that doesn't have an absolute standard, right? It's always an adaptation to the conditions. Some of the most advanced areas in Europe were also the least developed, in a sense, for example, from an agricultural point of view, in part because of course they could harvest more just because of the climate, of the fertility of the soil, etc. But also they were on the fore on many other technological fields. But if you look at the crop rates, was there an increase? No, right? You find areas where things even went worse, even during the time of the expansion. So we have unfortunately problems always because of that materialistic bias, technologistic bias towards this idea that civilization improves because of technology. Technology is just a consequence of a civilizational improvement, right? It's just created to satisfy other needs that are basically brought by the increase in moral force and material capacities of a world, right? And this shows us, in spite of in fact, the kind of democratic republican bias that also we decided in part to attach to the Middle Ages, actually it stems from actually a feudal world, right? A feudal world that is such, even in those areas that, yes, were more kind of democratic in nature, right? Because the mindset of those communities was not a modern one, was still framed within a hierarchy, right? The entire continent was considered to be part of universitates, that were essentially communities that were all turned towards the same objective, that were all part of a great hierarchy. Nobody was essentially criticizing the legitimacy of and the necessity of universal authorities such as the papacy and the empire, and the system was harmonic, right? And you can argue that it's only from this later time where in fact you see the same nobility and chivalry being emptied of that kind of individual merit, right, and becoming mostly like a juridically defined class, mostly also, yes, embodied by a lifestyle. These were powerful people. They would actually remain in charge because the nobility, in fact, made it through the great medieval crisis. They managed to put down the peasantry, those who were being left out, and that shows objectively their superiority, right? Because the rest of the people were many more, and if they really had wanted it, if they had really been provided with enough strength, they would have really kind of ninged the system. Instead, they failed, and they failed ruinously, because for half of a millennium there was no way to escape the system, and that therefore highlights how critical, after all, in the definition of such order, universal one and civilizational one, the leadership that had formed in the 10th century as the aristocratic military estate had been in properly leading the world towards the enormous, the vast directions, the vast horizons that are just evidenced in the dramatic Western compaction and overflowing during medieval times, and the incredible rise that will be essentially unstopped in spite even of the Eurasian crisis, and that will go on up to until even today, because frankly the tides have not turned yet, and we're seeing it actually now, because now we are witnessing a new crisis. In many ways, we can have some, let's say, like in the 14th century, some tail strike, somebody, especially of the lower element, that makes it in some decentralized areas where there is less control of the bigger systems, but the bigger system probably will prevail, right? The West will probably prevail again, and yet this depends on us. So the aristocracy for many centuries expressed its own social predominion in open and fluid forms, right? It was easy, after all, in the 10th or in the 11th century to become a miles, and to be even knighted, to be dubbed as a knight. And it was easy because there were many of these people. They had emerged, as we've seen, from everywhere, from this turmoilous, militarized situation of Europe that was eventually recontrolled. At this time, the feudal monarchies start emerging, the papacy starts assuming also an ecumenic control. The Crusades are launched to also channel this brutal force outside of the continent, or at least to extend it in various directions, and many other occupations are definitely present, but the military one is lucrative, right? In essentially the agricultural reality of the time, those who could afford just not much, even just the panoply or the horse, but properly all the costs of a perpetual training, whether it was actual war or just a tournament, were basically there was no difference, because there was no difference between the civilian or the military reality, especially for these individuals, was objectively able to afford it in a way or another. The militares were needed to mold the same order, right? So, and it took a long time to tame them, to discipline them, and in part this brought again to their discipline, but also to the loss of that individualistic, warrioristic ethos that had been necessary for them just to emerge in that wild world that now instead was getting ever more ordered and regularized. And in fact, it's only between the 12th and the 13th century that through the chivalric experience, the aristocracy was defined as the aforementioned juridically closed estate on an hereditary base. And this concept was not merely a socio-economical or in fact a secularistic necessity, right? The people of the time were viciously ultra confident in their own practically both moral and genetical superiority. This class was ferociously self-aware of the fact that according to the traditional belief, they were superior beings. They were closer to God, and their blood, in fact, nobility of blood at this point, hence the hereditary bond as well, was universally accepted in a otherwise, unregulated world where literally, basically, the succession criterion was the only one recognized by everybody in otherwise pretty, again, troubled society, to connect their own superiority to a matter, to genetics. Again, the nobility thought that peasants were not even real human beings. They thought they were half animals or something, because there was absolutely no sense of, let's say, national identities emerged, but in the Latin sense of the term. That is to say, of course, people that live close and speak the same language that more or less identify themselves also with these politics that emerge in that base. But the overwhelming, essence of tradition and its religious military creed was the individual superiority, a superiority that was essentially demonstrated by the same superiority. That is to say, if I am powerful, it's because God wants it, and so I have the right to rule. This is what the world had always believed, right? The stronger had the right to rule. The defeated had his chance, and he's just lucky if, the conqueror decides him to leave as a serf in a lesser status, fundamental, quality of existence, because he was responsible for it, and not getting killed instead. And so there was a great sense of themselves. It was ever more defined, especially when the world was definitely spreading in what seemed to be in a controlled fashion. Great part of what we see as statal development also between the 13th and 14th century does pass through the definition of nobility, because starting especially from the 12th century, the nobility is de facto challenged, also in power, by a new aristocracy that is what we call the bourgeois one, in a sense. These were rich merchants and very powerful people, as a matter of fact. So people who actually detained a real power, that were ever more and unavoidably attracted to the hegemonic aristocratic military culture, so that these merchants at some point began to live as knights, right? And vice versa at some point, because of course the same feudal lords were very often involved in business. Just all the raiding warfare was very often the loot was reinvested in the local markets or in these specialized crops and lots of things. So this elite also came to to blend in part, but still there were important differences that were felt, especially from a moral point of view. War is an experience like no other, right? It requires basically the top human quality to be performed effectively, and there was in fact a chance of divine transfiguration in combat, in the vision of these people, and there was something sacred in the cingulum militaris, so much that a knight factually had the faculty of dubbing, of creating another knight, right? And great part also of the investiture struggle derived from this tacitly, even though we read this mostly from the educated class, or the literate classes that were the clergy, that were the ever more distant, not necessarily opposite to the secular aristocrats, because just they worked most of the times and wrote for them, but they were the most distant mentally from the practice of warfare. So they actually had a pretty good understanding of what spiritual warfare was and how they could bring it to the extreme, but they were still setting it on other standards, on another lifestyle, in other ways that were not the military ones. And so we have somewhat forgotten how much the knighthood equated to a sort of priesthood, really, in tradition. Because again, being provided with the faculty of the Imperium, and this, as you understand, has deep consequences also in the struggle between universal power, provides you with some sacrality that was the one usually attributed in the European culture to the kings, to the rulers in general. And so there was something there that the church was also trying to discipline in its own way, because they said, yes, this is true, but remember that in fact you're just human beings. We don't see you transfiguring in combat, and so there must be some order that checks your ambition as well, and doesn't make you degenerate instead into a sort of a delirium of almightiness, let's say, that actually doesn't correspond to the factuality. That is to say that, for example, the empire was not even, in control of a part of the entire Christendom, and so where was the universal empire? It was not at the empire. So in fact, there are very interesting perspectives on this also in the history of how civilization eventually, how the world ages, and how the original standards were not met. From the golden age, things went ever worse, and they're keeping to get worse, and all cultures said that we live in the fourth age, as they believed already at the time, where properly with the twilight of the gods there is the ever greater distance between the discernment between good and evil that brings eventually humanity to be rigged in general. I mean, just think even speaking of the Germanic Middle Ages and the Ghibelline ideal, the ancient Germans already had, and were actually the ones who believed the most among the various Indo-European peoples in this dark, this tragic, end of existence, with properly some final struggle in which the gods will be killed, right, in part, and that where the balance of the world is always precarious, and things are going to be lost in practice, because the purity is already lost. The same Asgard has been built with the Nibelungen craft that is impure, because it's like the Promethean technologistic, in fact, materialistic bias that has infected the purity of the gods. And so it's a deep issue that also equates to the same original sin, and in this sense the church was actually pointing that out. And so acting as a checker, as a controller, and assuming this idea that instead it was the church never to be, impossible to be destroyed, to be killed, to fall, because the gates of hell shall not prevail. way it tells you the degree of self-confidence that especially Western Christianity had inherited from the Indo-European tradition, as opposed like to the Talmud that instead says, it's a bit difficult to believe that you will always prevail because, that kind of creates problems with the idea of redemption, etc. But these are things that we can maybe see in another video. The important is to however connect it to the spirit of the Middle Ages that in part may seem contradictory to those who believe, in fact, that are hopelessly anti-Christian and anti-theistic, and they think for some reason that there is this dramatic negative revolution brought by the Bible, but in the Western tradition. But if you actually look at what it means, they are both asymptotic and overlapping, and they're just looking at the same thing essentially. One looking from one side, the other looking from the other, and still in a cultural sense, in the practice and the reality, they're basically just a continuity of the same idea, but in a broader universal form that depends on man, not on the type of belief that after all was the same, and they actually share the same idea. So we are witnessing the de facto nobility evolving in de jure nobility, according to the effective terminology by Mark Bloch. Said a lot of interesting things. For example, he compared this was a very long-term period, right, and especially a very vast dimension. It was solicited by the same developments as we've seen of the European society that from the 11th century is committed in this enormous effort of institutional systematization of its own communities, because they are literally overflowing, and as you know, we've seen it many times, this dramatic risk of fragmentation, of heresy spreading, etc. Instead, the order, reason, properly clarity, control, discipline prevails, right? And this is all controlled by the elite, whichever it is, right? Not just the feudal one. Whoever was powerful enough, but invested themselves in this rational order. And it's also, in fact, process of juridical and cultural definition through the elaboration and the coding of literally everything that culture could, that Europe could bring, like in terms of values, symbols, ceremonies, behavioral models, privileges connected and aimed to an estate dominion, right? Being a knight at this point starts becoming a big deal. You can be like a horseman, maybe even somebody fighting in the heavily armored fashion, provided with all the excellent training, both especially the collective one that was making heavy cavalry, the top, even though the individual one was still extremely high. But you may have not been a knight because you've not been dubbed, and this also was not such a categorical difference as it may seem. It was mostly a sanctioning of this in the environment where they were living, right? It was the king maybe deciding that knight had been particularly courageous, been an example for everyone, could be dubbed and elevated. And also by the king, there was this sense that in fact the hierarchy still expressed this sacrality, and so being, I don't know, dubbed by Louis the Saint was a big deal, just for the memory of the family, etc., as opposed to being knighted just because, before a battle by somewhere in a skirmish by a baron, right? It was a huge deal. Usually it happened also before battles, but it could be just a way of self-celebration that was sanctioning publicly that order. For example, I don't know, in the patriciate of city-states, there could be, only a few families could afford economically a dubbing celebration in the city where they There was all the ceremony in church, there were banquets, tournament, all paid by the family, that could therefore say, look, this guy now, he's a knight because we're that powerful, we're the ruling clan, and the others are just a bunch of, of poor motherfuckers that cannot do that. So that was a heavy and powerful thing, because literally, eventually, those who came to power, who remained in power largely, were essentially connected to these systems. Now, Bloch, again, if you read him in that chapter, there's literally titled from the passage from the noblesse de facto to noblesse de iure, traces these main differences. France unavoidably was the country where this regulation was more marked. First of all, because it was the more politically compact country, and also the largest one in that sense, and also the cradle of feudalism in many ways. So the establishment was already, let's say, better, was advantage in affording properly this sanctioning, in keeping the other elements, the other estates down, and so to crystallize ever more a nobility that is a hell of a nobility, as you know, in the French case, and that will fundamentally remain the elite, the ruling class up to the French Revolution, even though, of course, there was some social change historically, also because France went through many upheavals. But at the time was evident. And somebody may criticize this as saying, okay, these guys were becoming ever more powerful, so that what was even their point of continuing to live as warriors? And some see by the end of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th, especially after the French bloodshed at Courtrai at the hands of the Bourgenses, of the Flemish towns, infantry, right? So something like, who are these guys? As Villani says, everybody thought that the Flemish were just rabbits filled in butter up to that day, and instead these guys are all galvanized by having defeated the flower French cavalry in that astonishing battle. And the decline, if you want, of the same French military quality, I am quite skeptical about that, because if you really see what happens is that remains a hallmark of the French military for a long time to come. Also as a fault still, but still showing the power that these people actually maintained. It's true that also by the mid 14th century, there's a refeudalization of the European nobility by a certain degree, because there's a major crisis. Also, war strikes again. So the men-at-arms, whatever their background was, kind of become ever more performing, even in this warfare that is becoming ever more technical and dangerous for the same cavalry, right? Obviously, cavalry at that point declined in absolute terms, never re-achieved the superiority obtained on the 13th century council and battlefield. But still, in fact, from a political and social point of view, those are the same noblemen that have remained at the top. And as such, they are just mostly by the wealth of their lifestyle, rather than necessarily just the military performance. And so there are also many other mechanisms that we can see with the rise of mercenaries that in part are due to, in fact, the impoverishment of the rest of the nobility, of those who had not made it to remain at the top. And this brings to many other changes that we have documented in other videos. In the empire, things got instead way more out of hand, because the mid 13th century is the moment in which the German national monarchy is aborted. The Italian city-states are becoming ever de facto independent. So in the empire, every estate kind of began to define itself in different ways. The Hohenstaufen had tried to put some kind of limits to the creation of knights that were not in fact, sons of other knights. But who were the Germans to say that when 90% of, say, of the southern German knights were ministeriales, were servants traditionally. But in any case, that was important, because in Germany, that difference between the nobility and the ministeriales up to that point had passed through the important juridical distinction. It is to say, in Germany, exactly because of the difficulties of establishing a public authority, let's say the nobility was not as powerful as the French one, but it still was locally more impositive, let's say, more ferocious and more autocratic, let's say, than elsewhere. So in Germany, traditionally, even just the rest of the people were under somebody else, right? Were somebody else's people. So the nobility was evident, right? And that's why also the ministeriales had been born, because literally they could be made at will by either public authority of the local nobleman, because there was that nobility existing. After the collapse of the national monarchy, there is like cities, princes, the same emperor, for the type of control that had on these things, that define the knightly class. In fact, in the German diets, there is properly an estate of knights that remains historically, and that had its own importance. So because the Germans, as we were saying before, were also kind of in their Ghibelline ideal, were pretty wary of the original, the ancestral sacrality of, and the almost priestly power of knighthood. Like, even look at the beautiful German epos and the Minnesänger, etc. What properly how they sing the knighthood, right? Which is even different from the kind of more courtly, lively, amorous one of the Occitanian courts. Even more from Italy, because in Italy instead it's a matter of wealth, right? Everybody becomes, say, not a knight, but it can, in the consular class of the communes, can essentially is forced, because it's a privilege and a duty to fight as a heavily armored horseman, right? And there's a lot of competition. Interestingly enough, all these countries have their lock by the 13th to 14th, by the 12th to 13th century, of defining who the milites are, and by which degree. But every country does it in kind of a different way, right? Say that is not much of a difference in practice eventually to say who are these people, especially from a military point of view, but let's say in the political and social system, considering what were the premises, the basis or not. After all, for example, in the Italic kingdom, said people were traditionally free since longer time. So even the idea of citizenry, as the older Romano-Germanic idea of nobility, persisted incredibly, and that's why also, in part, in spite this were commoners, they could also participate to the militia of the commune as heavily armored men, because it was their right after all. They were already considered as noblemen in arms. Interestingly enough, Bloch identifies in the English nobility a very homogeneously and compact and military and almost imperialistically oriented, especially under the Angevin, under the Angevins, estate, right? Where also the English barons have a great control on their own communities, right? And in these communities, the true freemen, let's say, are also provided with kind of a more nobiliar sense of themselves than everywhere. They're not all, right? There are, the majority of people is under. We also made a video how the English nobility, albeit at least until the Magna Carta, importantly controlled by the monarchy, really have a lot of power in their own fiefs, It's just that they're many and kind of balanced for the crown to, among each other, parceled enough in their territory as well to control initially. And also the freemen maintained a sense that maybe it's an Anglo-Saxon legacy, or it's just maybe the process of a functionalization of also English intervention in France or something, that because that was mostly the also the connection that is much more marked than, say, in France, right? The forms are very similar, but the practice is very different. And this probably confers to England this also aggressive imperialistic capacity that it uses to take control over most of France, and to even almost wipe out the Carpathians at the beginning of the 13th century and invading Ireland and claiming properly. But that was, it was present in the Anglo-Saxon mentality. As soon as they set foot on the island, they said, this is ours and everybody's under us. Right? That was the idea. And we will perhaps deepen on this examples. And naturally, there are different other realities in Europe that we will see individually, but these are kind of the most relevant in a sense. This aspect is really crucial. Not everywhere being a knight meant to be a midas or meant to be a noble, right? So these are three different things actually. They're combined in different ways depending on the situation. It's just that this is important. By the end of, let's say, by the second half of the 12th century onwards, especially during the 13th, there's a great definition, also a pretty rigid one, inescapable, especially connected to the inheritability of the knightly title, especially in the most feudalized areas of Europe, that leaves out everybody else. And this was done exactly in essentially for the sake of cooptation, right? Was the idea I define better what this class is, so that I will provide them with important exemptions, again, privileges, properly some benefits that will help them consolidate their political and social status, so that by controlling these guys, I will control larger amounts of people and land. And so as a central power, I will manage to rely more firmly on my subjects, right? And by the way, the French monarchy already by the 13th century was, in order to also counterbalance the great power of these lords, because France was already formed like this. But let's say what happens now is that the monarchy is asking these people to remain loyal to the monarchy properly, right? So in order to do this, France is also enormously powerful, starts creating a body of functionaries that are drawn from the bourgeoisie, and that also creates, in fact, a lot of perplexity. I mean, sometimes the aforementioned merchants, etc., were dubbed as knights by the king, and they were important people. If you wonder why, for example, during the XIII in the mid-14th century, you have Etienne Marcel, this important city figures that are really powerful, and they side with the peasantries, because gradually the nobility had managed properly to leave out the other estates from the third one, especially from the system. So as it happened in other times in history, the middle class allies itself even with what we would call the proletarians, so the peasantry. And in that instance, and cities like Paris are very powerful, right? They're some of the largest in Europe, but they are brought under even there, and the XIII is brought under, and with a bath of peasant blood, right? For which it will, that scale, a rebellion will not happen in centuries again. So, asserting the superiority of the nobility, right? So this also, however, the France per se had managed to do that, because this functionarial class that the king is using next to the nobility to control, especially the tax collection, the exercise of justice, etc., that is often a check to the imbalancement to the nobility itself, is depending on the monarchy and is acquiring power on its own. And it's so strong exactly because by not being noblemen, and so not really being able to inherit their own prerogatives, they depend entirely on the king. They're becoming the new ministeriales, in a sense, literally, because that's also what the term was used for. And so by the modern age, you have such a great power. However, these individuals that, as you know, in France, you will hear of the noblesse de paix and noblesse de robe, that is to say, the previous noble knightly military aristocracy, and instead the robe nobility. It is those aristocracies, put it in this way, that, or properly nobility in that case, that because the titles were issued, right, as properly as noblemen sometimes, that were the functionaries locally. But consider that, I don't know, extremely important people, like, for example, lawyers, doctors of law, were knighted. It was a tradition in the empire, in the Italian city-states. If you were a doctor in law, where you were so important because you were so powerful, you were so useful for the local government, that you were knighted. You were a knight. You figured as a knight. And this was an obsequium to the sacrality of that. This is also valid for the poets. Why were they crowned, etc.? Because it was the same idea of detaining the imperium, of having so much moral power to be essentially the same level of warriors, in a way. Naturally, we could talk over and over again about this, because there's so much that justice, what let's say, we tend to also teach by exception sometimes, but if you look at how rigidly established this, especially inheritance right, was, nobility or status, you're really, like, it was almost a paranoid thing. You could not fool yourself about who you were. You had to be ever more trackable in your origin, because otherwise the system could not recognize you. And this, again, was connected originally to the idea that the nobility had won on the battlefield its own superiority, and that this passed through kind of a blood superiority in practice. There was a much more deeply rooted idea in all Indo-European peoples than today the kind of multiculturalist bias has made you foolishly believe, right? All ancient peoples discriminated ferociously on an ethnic level. The fact that some could participate, even if they were from different backgrounds, still meant that they were considered, however, as participating to a power that either they had earned, but that was not traditionally conceived as, it was fluid, again, but was not initially conceived, especially on the grounds of the imperium. That is to say, it was a ruling people that allowed the others by cooptation to participate to its own power. And if they were up to it, okay. And it's a pretty good idea, after all, because it's not much of a ethnic discrimination per se. It's simply saying that that individual that has achieved that much also has some kind of quality that is inherent to him, that deserves that soul, that is all one with the body part, to be transmitted to his descent, right? It's a very, also, you would be surprised, it's capitalistic concept, because it entails that you have a right on your own inheritance. You have a right to rule. You have a right, because of your parents, to maintain the values, the tradition, the order, the rule, and the authority, and the standards, the individual superiority and quality that you have to show, right, in order to maintain the system. And indeed, if you look at European aristocracy, you realize that in spite of the relative gentrification that occurred in their costumes, well, still up to the 17th, the 18th century, well, a nobleman was meant to go at war on a regular basis. And there is a very few that, in this sense, you can say by, oh, well, it's not really the case, or, but they were people with massive responsibilities and that really ruled the world. So yes, they maybe were not doing it from, say, so intensively as before from the battlefield, but if you want to rule a state, it will have to go to war sometimes. You also require lots of other skills that are not just military, and you also have some responsibility, like not like a Philip III could die in battle, and still being kind of up to the political social standards of the time for France to live on. Louis XIV would have really not, right? And Louis XIV was somebody who really didn't have any command capacity, apparently, but still made of France the hegemonic continental power in Europe, and made a military reform that was exceptional and the greatest, in Europe at the time. That reveals how deeply understood what the military was about. And incidentally enough, albeit France was the most advanced army in Europe, it also was the least technological one. Think about that, because that means that, as always, technology alone is zero. Doctrine is everything. In any case, for today, we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.